Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Should non-citizen immigrants vote? My guest says yes. I'm skeptical. My guest is Ron Hayduk, the author of the just-published Democracy for All, Restoring Immigrant Voting Rights in the United States. Ron is the co-founder of the Immigrant Voting Project and the New York Coalition to Expand Voting Rights. He teaches political science at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and he was at one time my teaching assistant. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Your button, let all New Yorkers vote. Yesterday in the Red Room at City Hall,
Yes.
you had a press briefing on the Voting Rights Restoration Act. What is this act? Who's sponsoring? Why do we need it?
Okay, the act is actually a holdover reintroduction of legislation that was introduced last year called Intro 628 by Councilman Bill Perkins. This year's prime sponsor is Charles Barron, but there's a number
Which will guarantee wide exposure for
There's
it.
a broad number of city council members who are co-sponsors, and
How many now?
we have about 10, and there's going to be more people that I think are going to climb on board.
Before we move on, you need 26 to pass it.
Correct.
Can you get 26?
We believe so.
Can you get 34 to override a veto? Because we know that the mayor is opposed to this.
Well, you know, it's like a lot of legislation. Once you get a number of people to sign on, it's easier for others to follow. And especially, I think, as the issue gets out there and the issues get debated and discussed, I think that more people will realize that this is a really valid piece of legislation.
Okay, talk about this Voting Rights Restoration Act. What would it do?
Okay. You mentioned my button.
Yes.
You notice that there's a red X
Through one of the five characters.
people.
Yes.
This symbolizes that in New York City today, there are 1 out of 5 adult New Yorkers who are denied the right to vote. Right? They're
Or, I mean, looking at the opponents, they might say have not yet sought through citizenship the right to vote.
That is one of the arguments against it,
Go
but
ahead.
it's not always been the case historically that voting is tied to citizenship. This may be a surprise to a lot of your
Hence
viewers.
the word restoration. We'll talk to that.
Exactly.
Let's get to this bill. What does this bill do?
Okay, the bill would grant voting rights to legal residents of the city who've resided here for 6 months or longer.
No illegal.
Correct.
And you're making no differentiation between permanent student visas?
Anyone who's here with documentation, anyone that has a legal visa, work visas, student visas, there's visas from A to Z.
Wait a minute. But, I mean, don't you want people to have a stake in the system?
Right.
When you allow people
Yes.
on student visas, these people don't necessarily have a stake.
You teach at the City University like me. Two of the 200,000+ CUNY students, about half are immigrants or children of immigrants. They have a stake in what happens at the City University of New York. They have a stake in how often the streets are cleaned. They have a stake in affordable housing. They have a stake in access to health care. They have a stake in how many ESL classes that are available. They all want to learn English.
Right, but is the response give immigrants the right to vote or address those particular problems in a very concrete way? It seems almost like a sideshow to a certain extent.
It'd be nice if the elected officials, and we have many good ones, would do that on their own. But I think this mechanism, the vote, helps keep elected officials in government responsive, representative, and accountable to all New Yorkers, not just to some. And we're talking about a sizable portion of the population that's politically excluded. It's on the order of the political exclusion of African Americans before the Voting Rights Act. It's profoundly undemocratic and un-American.
Okay, we'll talk about the un-American in terms of history. Let's go back to the legislation. Is there nothing that prevents this by state constitution? In other words, can this act which would allow voting for all citywide, all local, all borough-wide officials. Can it pass constitutional muster?
There's nothing in the state constitution that limits voting to U.S. federal citizens. New York State election law requires voting for U.S. citizens. But thankfully, there is legal counsel, expert legal counsel, that has pointed out that New York City's home rule charter powers give it the authority to define its electorate.
Ooh, I bet you this one's in the courts for a while.
It's possible, but
and
I think it's going to withstand a challenge.
Well, even if it doesn't, it certainly would highlight and dramatize the issue, which is much of what the purpose of this is. Okay, now, one thing struck me both about the bill and its name and the organization that you're part of. One, the bill says Voting Rights Restoration Act, and you've alluded to that. And the other one says New York Coalition to Expand Voting Rights.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you just look at the words and how you and your organization's trying to frame and define the issue,
right.
It's good you folks who might be opposed to it because this is the way it used to be and this is nothing new, while your other audience, the new immigrants, presumably, we're expanding the rights. So what is it? Are you restoring or expanding?
It's both, of course.
Okay.
And let me start with the restoring, but ultimately it's about expansion. I mean, interestingly, there's a narrative about democracy in the United States, which is this sort of ever-unfolding expansion of democracy. You know, once it was only white men with property that had to vote, and we, of course, excluded African Americans. The Civil War solved that problem for African American males. The suffragettes,
at least theoretically and constitutionally, not in practice in the South or in the North, for that matter.
Women got the right to vote in 1920. 18-year-olds got the vote in 1971 or 72.
Yeah.
So this business of who's eligible to vote, who's in the franchise, who's got the right to the vote, has in fact expanded over time. But the story is
but women were citizens prior to their getting the vote.
So were African Americans.
So were African Americans.
Which goes to the point that it's about restoring something that existed, and that voting has never been tied to citizenship.
Give us some history. The first chapter of the book talks about the 150 years between 1776 and 1926.
That's a long time.
3 minutes or less. Explain what was going on.
But for 150 years, from the founding until 1926, that's the majority of our country's history. Non-citizens had the right to vote in 40 states and federal territories, not just in a few. The majority of the country could vote in local, state, and even federal elections. And I think it's fascinating that this part of our history has been forgotten or hidden, and certainly we want to revive that memory and that history. And thankfully, there's a movement on the ground today, aside from just New York City, which I'd like to talk about, in other parts of the country where voting rights have been restored to immigrants, and there's campaigns to restore those.
And also there have been campaigns that have been unsuccessful in doing that as well, and
yes.
we can talk about that as well. Why don't you give us, I mean, do you want to continue with the walkthrough of restoration, or do you want to go right to the reasons?
Let me talk a little bit about the history.
Go
because
ahead.
I think a lot of people may wonder, well, why was this eliminated? If it was such, a common practice and a good idea,
Sure.
Why was it eliminated? And I think it actually gets to some of the issues for today. With the influx of newer kinds of immigrants and larger numbers of immigrants, the right to vote for immigrants became contentious.
You're talking about the Great Wave in the 1890s, early 1900s?
But even prior to that.
Okay.
Actually, one of the reasons why in New York was one of the first places to roll back the right to...
Irish?
Well, it was actually the radicals from the French Revolution.
Ooh,
which
that's so early.
Which scared a lot of the elites.
So this was at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century that happened in New York.
But leading up to the Civil War, just after the large wave of immigration of Irish and Germans, not WASPs, right? Catholics was the main distinction, but there's an interesting book called How the Irish Became White.
Right.
Were not universally perceived as American.
Neither were the Italians or the Jews a half a century later.
Even more so because of their color. At any rate, partly because the Irish opposed slavery, the slave states were especially opposed to having immigrants vote. And their first plank in the Confederate Constitution would have required voting for people only born in U.S. soil. But the point is that it's been contentious at these moments in time. And then, as you mentioned, with as the 20th century got closer, and this massive, the largest immigration in U.S. history of mostly Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Jews, Greeks, Scandinavians, a whole host of folks. Again, this sort of influx alarmed elites within both parties. Because
you have the
those at the
tremendous
same time
xenophobic reaction. You have the Palmer raids, you have Sacco and Vanzetti, you have the Reed Johnson Act, the
and you have mass social movements, the populist movement, the labor movement, the socialist movement, and third political parties, which were attractive to these newcomers. And there was real fear that the vote could lead to a shift in political power away from those who currently held political power. So they
Which is still the case.
They eliminated non-citizen voting rights, and they imposed other restrictions, which again are another pockmark on our history, and it's sort of like this one step forward in terms of voting rights and two steps back. Those restrictions being poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, felony disenfranchisement, very restrictive residency and voter registration
requirements.
And so
we know that in New York.
We disenfranchised literally millions of not just immigrants, but poor and working class people.
Why the modern, if you will, cause? Why the resurgence of the issue? And sort of a personal take on it. How did you get involved in this? I mean, you are a true believer in the best sense.
I believe in justice.
As well as a scholar. So talk about how you came to the issue, how you came to the book, and then talk about the arguments for.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess my Italian and Slovakian roots helped me be sensitive to the plight of immigrants. Hearing some of the stories from my grandmother, my parents, how they were not universally accepted and treated, nicely, was sort of a surprise in the civics classes that I got.
Naive, come on.
Well, I think a lot of us were and still are. And when I took a position as the coordinator of the Voter Assistance Commission, I had an opportunity.
Which is what? Explain.
It's a nonpartisan city agency mandated by the city charter to facilitate voter registration and participation of underrepresented groups.
Okay.
So our mission was to try to get people registered, educated, mobilized, and turned out to vote.
Right.
Well, when we started looking at the numbers from the census of who were the non-voters, it became very clear that there were this huge number of people who were not even eligible for us to go after because they were not citizens. But there were a huge number of people.
Right.
1 in 5. And that's not small potatoes. And having studied political participation and knowing that from my government experience as well as from my study of political science, elected officials in government more generally can ignore those that don't vote, and often do, sadly. We don't have the most enlightened statesmen, although we have many. This mechanism is profoundly important, the right to vote. It keeps people accountable, it keeps them responsive, it keeps them in touch with the needs. And these folks are really under attack right now.
Why not become citizens? And go ahead.
It's not mutually exclusive. I'm all for people becoming citizens. In fact, my
But you don't see it as the
ancestors,
sine qua non.
It's not. Well, it
a
was
necessary.
It's
condition.
not necessary.
Right.
I mean, it was never necessary. It's not necessary today. It was good enough for a lot of folks for 150 years. It's good enough today. And let me
Post 9/11 makes sense too.
Yeah, I think because for the most part,
at least
most
the politics
of
the situation.
Well, the politics, it's straight democracy.
Okay.
It's straight up democracy. It's taxation without representation.
Wait a minute.
Consent of the governed.
Wait a minute. You're throwing around these highfalutin terms. Taxation without representation. The state of New York takes taxes out of my salary, even though I'm a Jersey resident. I cannot vote in the state of New York. So taxation without representation is honored often in the breach here. I mean, don't forget, it's a propaganda call. Is it a bedrock principle here? I don't know. Do I have a constitutional claim to my salary in New York on no taxation without representation?
You'd be the best person to answer that one. But I think the folks that live here have a stake in how their tax dollars are spent, and they have no say about that right now. They certainly, I mean, that was the logic behind allowing immigrants to vote in the school boards. You have kids in the schools. You should have a say about how your tax dollars are spent, how their education
And Chicago
goes.
still does.
Chicago has school, allows immigrants to vote in school board elections, and 6 towns in Maryland allow non-citizens to vote in all municipal elections in those 6 towns.
Right.
But and
not
there's
in
campaigns.
Go ahead.
There's campaigns across the country that are currently underway that would grant voting rights to non-citizens.
Talk just briefly, allude to those.
California, San Francisco in 2004 had a proposition on the ballot.
But that went down.
It lost by 51 to 49%. It barely lost. It's going to
This is San Francisco, don't forget that.
But it's going to be revived there as
Okay.
well. There's discussion in San Bernardino and several other places in California.
Okay.
Portland, Maine, this year is going to put it on the ballot. Amherst and Cambridge, Massachusetts have already passed laws at the local level. They're waiting state enabling legislation.
These sound like atypically liberal.
Okay, how about Washington, D.C.?
And enlightened
about
places. I wouldn't call
Wa-
Washington, D.C. enlightened. I'll
Washington,
take that back.
D.C., in places in Connecticut, in New Jersey, in South Carolina, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin. There's campaigns that are ongoing right now.
Prospects in each of the realistic assessments of possibilities
Time
of
will
success
tell, but
anywhere?
I think absolutely so.
Where does the breakthrough take place? What's the first major jurisdiction that does it, and why?
New York City is the first major jurisdiction that does it in the school board elections, and then
Well, they don't have it now.
we lost those. But I mean, it put it back on the map.
Right.
And as you know, there has been legislation introduced at the state level to allow non-citizens to vote, not just in local elections, but also state elections.
Yeah, but if I'm not mistaken, that legislation's only limited to permanent legal residents,
That's
where
correct.
yours is much more expansive.
That's right.
I want to get to that expansive notion here. The opposition's argument, the critics' argument that voting is the symbol of the stake in the system, and that, for example, somebody on a student visa or not a permanent resident, the question is, what is the nature of the stake in the system? Now, it's raised of all immigrants. You know, this sort of my country phenomenon. No, your country's the United States, say the nativists. Is there, one of the critics is, the nature of the loyalties and what absence of citizenship means about those things?
Okay, and I actually want to go back to your
Go.
point about, why not gain citizenship first, but the business of divided loyalties first. You come from New Jersey, you just said, right? So you have a stake, though, in the kinds of services that are available, how well the subway runs and so forth.
Sure.
Here in New York, and you pay taxes.
Right, but I don't have representation.
You don't
as
have
we
the right to
pointed out.
vote in New York. But you have a stake in how well the system functions here in the city. If you were to have lived in New York, you could move from New Jersey to New York and register and vote in 25 days, right? Why can't someone come from the Dominican Republic and learn enough about what they need to know in terms of affordable housing, education, healthcare, to be able to have a
But
say?
the irreducible answer almost becomes inarguable because it's an a priori position. I mean, it's almost not arguable that comes with citizenship. I guess the critics' argument.
We all have
Go ahead.
common interests in, safe streets, in affordable housing, in good education, in quality jobs, and we all have those common
But
interests.
wait a minute. Does giving immigrants the vote, given their particular demographies and socioeconomics, does it lead to all those beneficent social consequences?
Well, certainly.
Or is the world more zero-sum than this, in that I might argue that your future in your book is utopian, and that may not be a criticism, but unrealistic.
We're not going to all agree, but a vigorous debate about the issues would really enliven our polity and our politics. And given the decline in voter turnout, I think this the infusion of not only new voters but potentially new issues might actually help invigorate the polity. And if there are debates and disagreements about the newcomers, who's an American, who should be...
But Ron, you know the history.
This is a great opportunity to fight some of that out.
When the 18-year-olds got the vote and the women got the right to vote, the percentage of increase of the total electorate didn't go up; it went down.
Initially, yes.
And it's been low ever since. So what gives you any empirical basis to believe that this group of immigrants is going to be different themselves and be so stimulative that they're going to raise the attention? The only way it'll happen is if it produces conflict. That'll raise the temperature and the attention.
Well, there's no doubt that there will be some conflict. And actually, interestingly, historically, when non-citizens were given the right to vote, start with New York City school board elections. The first election was in 1970. Turnout was 14%. This was in May when no other elections were happening.
Odd time. Well,
but no other elections were happening, so no other city elections were happening. People are just showing up to vote in school board. 14% of the population turned out to vote. This last mayoral election that Mayor Bloomberg won, 3.9 million registered voters, 755,000 people turned out to vote. The percentage is not so far off in terms of the turnout. Turnout declined in the school board elections over time, partly because there was a lack of education, a disaffection and disillusionment with some of the school boards. The same thing happened in Maryland. When Maryland, or Tacoma Park in Maryland, the largest city in Maryland, enfranchised non-citizens in school board in all municipal elections, the turnout in the first few years was comparable by non-citizens to citizens in the 6 wards as they're broken down in Tacoma Park. Over time, that's declined, partly because, again, some of those issues and candidates are less contentious, partly because, frankly, they acknowledge that there's been a lack of public education and political mobilization. And then 2001, interestingly, the laws that were passed in New York City and in Maryland do not make a distinction between so-called legal and illegal immigrants. All immigrants of any status were allowed to vote and did. But obviously 2001 and even the 1996 legislation at the federal level made it much more difficult and scary and threatening and vulnerable for undocumented folks to show up.
If you give the right to vote to the folks that you intend to, would that not decrease the incentive for being a citizen? Because if voting is so important and having a stake and acting on the stake is so important, then it would seem to be that since you've got your voice in the stake, that the incentives for citizenship would be mitigated, if not eliminated, among those who sought it.
I've heard this objection before, and
I'm sure you have.
It's one that thankfully there's an absolute no answer to. That is, it's not going to reduce the incentives to naturalize. People want to become U.S. citizens.
There's data on
this.
But
it takes, there's survey research that shows that most immigrants want to become U.S. citizens. There's some that have some ambivalences, of course, because transnationalism is a lot more of an option these days, at least among some immigrants.
Well, but doesn't that raise a philosophical question about the nature of the citizen, the nature of the state, the nature of a political community and nation? I know I sound like a political scientist there, unfortunately.
That's okay,
but
I can relate.
These issues are profound, and non-citizen voting really, and in many ways, flies in the face not only of conventional wisdom, but I think some core values too.
Okay, well let me go back to the first point, which is the average time it takes now for someone to become a citizen is much longer than it used to be. It's 8 to 10 years now.
If that's the problem, streamline the citizenship process.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Let's make it easier for people.
It's not an either or.
Absolutely. Let's do it all.
It's synergy.
But absolutely. Let's make it easier for people to become a citizen. It used to be easier, faster, and cheaper. It's much more difficult. It's much more time-consuming.
I mean, clearly part of it's post-9/11.
Well, no doubt, but that's not an excuse for making it difficult for someone to become a citizen. And there's so many rights.
Maybe that is the purpose, to make it more difficult.
Well, if that is, it's a nefarious reason, and not a very inclusive and democratic posture
throwing
to
around all these framing words.
We pride ourselves on being a nation of immigrants. and who helped actually build this country.
Yeah, but isn't the notion of the nation of
now
immigrants different? I mean, and that
it's because they were different immigrants? Is it because they were Italians and Jews like us, or was it because?
Or is it the nature of the communication and transportation? I mean, what is it?
I think that the fact that a lot of the newcomers come from Latin America, from Asia, from the Caribbean, from other places.
So they're not like us. So there's a racial racist element.
We have a racist history. We have a nativist backlash right now, and I think there's a racial element to this.
Yeah, and then you phrase this in terms of people of color versus whites. I mean, there's this stark dichotomy in the final chapter. I mean, are these really the fault lines, or is that too simple or simplistic?
Well, there's many fault lines, sadly, that we have that divide us, but there's a lot of things that do make us common, and one of them is values of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And but going back to the immigrants that came, our ancestors, we were not, the Italians and Jews that came initially were not universally seen as Americans and assimilatable.
Right.
And some of the arguments, people don't know enough. They have divided loyalties. They need.
It's deja vu all over again, as Yogi might put it.
It's the same kind of arguments.
Okay.
As Yogi would put, or that African Americans or women really don't know enough. We need to educate them. We got to give them more time. I mean, it smacks of some pretty, horrible kind of, racist or patronizing things that we pride ourselves on. We're across the country and the globe saying, we need to bring democracy to all kinds of places in the world.
Bring it to New York City, says Ron Hayduk.
Yeah, I mean.
Okay.
We have the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island here. What better place to
play
restore
with the symbols? I love it.
Immigrant voting than New York?
You got 30
We'd
seconds.
make history again.
What do you both foresee empirically? What's going to happen, and what do you want to see, and how are they different?
I think there's going to be a significant
seconds.
fight in the City Council over this legislation. I think there's going to be a lot of members that line up behind it. There's going to be a lot of debate and discussion. And I thank you for the opportunity to have that with you today. I think that it's going to really, if this law were to pass, and I think it has a real good shot to pass, it's going to shake up politics in this town in ways we haven't seen in a long time.
Give us a website.
You can go to immigrantvoting.org, www.immigrantvoting, all one word, .org. That's the Immigrant Voting Project website.
You'll have to come back when this legislation gets defeated or passed.
I look forward to that opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care, Ron.